Quite apart from the fact that she isn't of noble blood, Mrs. Simpson has twice been in the divorce courts. To my mind, that completely rules her out as Queen of England.
Well, after the abdication, Wallis Simpson was regarded as somebody who was dangerous. She was regarded as the woman who had destroyed the king, the woman who had brought down Edward VIII, and she was seen as somebody who was not worth bothering with.
For 35 years, every single day after the wedding, she did her best to fulfill him, to make him happy, and she genuinely did make him happy, and yet the court of public opinion never forgave her.
I think Meghan had quite a difficult initial period after their relationship was confirmed, and we know this because Harry issued a statement defending her and sort of warning people off. You know, she described it as disheartening and discriminatory. But Harry himself mentioned sort of racial undertones.
I think there is now an allegation of racism hanging over a member or members of the royal family. We don't know who, as we said earlier, not the Queen, not the Duke of Edinburgh, but beyond that, we don't know who. Harry and Meghan wouldn't say.
To carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
Look, they're clearly very unhappy with the royal existence that they have at the moment and the way that their public life impinges on them. It's something they clearly want to change.
I think the whole plan that Harry and Meghan have is a really problematic one because they're talking about stepping back. Their critics would argue, about having their cake and eat it. They're talking about one day representing the Queen on a foreign tour to another country, on another day, say in North America, earning serious money with some sort of endorsement of some sort of product.
Wallis had been born in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States.
Wallis Simpson came from a very well-bred American family. She was very well educated. She went to a very good all-girls school, Oldfields, in Baltimore. Her father died when she was a baby and her mother was a single mother, and her childhood was difficult. She absolutely adored her mother, but they were very much at the mercy of her mother's brother, Uncle Sol, who was a very dictatorial, difficult, demanding man. The reason I think that Wallis married incredibly young was because she felt that she would have a form of financial security, and that would be a relief for her mother. And in fact, this fear of penury dogged her all her life, and people said that it even infected the Prince of Wales. And I think her fear of not having enough absolutely informed why at the end of her life she changed her will and left everything to the Louis Pasteur Institute in France at the behest of this satanic lawyer, Maitre Bloom, who terrified her and said, if you don't leave everything to the French, you will be evicted from your house in France. And this stemmed right back to her childhood, which was one of financial insecurity.
He was in the Navy as an American Navy officer. That relationship broke down because of the long absences the two spent apart, mainly because he was away on active service.
She discovered on her honeymoon that he was an alcoholic, and at this point she had never had a drink. She came from a very strict family background, and she didn't have alcohol.
Wallis was a great horse rider, but she was also a great sort of society hostess. She was great at putting on parties. She was a great fan of the cinema. She aspired to a kind of Hollywood glamour in the way that she looked, and I think she was besotted, certainly in the 10s and 20s, with the new emergent form of media, which was Hollywood cinema.
What's so fascinating about Wallis Simpson is the perceived narrative now is that she was some sort of femme fatale and she was a racy figure and she manipulated the Prince of Wales. When the reality was she was actually very prudish, very conservative in the way she dressed, in her bearing, in her being. She was a woman ahead of her time. She could not see why or how she should remain in a marriage that was abusive to her. So eventually she did escape and she travelled with a friend to China. And her so-called Lotus year again has been utterly manipulated and denigrated by biographers, saying that she learned tricks of sexual perversion and all these things, which the Wallis I encountered was just so far from who she was.
Wallis Simpson is, I think, one of the most vilified women of the 20th century, most of which I think is dictated by misogyny, pure and simple. I think that the idea of a strong, confident woman who is forging her own path in the world was seen with absolute terror by people who didn't like the idea of this person who couldn't be kept down, wasn't answerable to anyone, didn't belong to the British codes of conduct.
Meghan Markle is a California girl. In fact, her dad, Thomas, was in the film industry. He worked on set. And one of Meghan's earliest memories, actually, and what she says inspired her to be an actress, was being on set of the show Married with Children, a show that her dad worked on for years as a lighting director, I believe. Meghan grew up very much, not so much in the industry, but close, kind of on the periphery of show business. I think she got a real taste of it from a very early age. And Meghan was always a natural performer. We've seen videos of her in school plays. We know that she was always kind of gravitating towards the stage and being on stage. Meghan seemed to do really well with the kind of attention and scrutiny that came with being an actress. And there's no doubt that really from an early age, Meghan always kind of stood out from the rest of her peers.
There is no doubt that when anybody marries into the royal family, the media immediately start looking into the background and the family of that person. I mean, with Meghan, it was quite easy because she'd been very public on social media and on the internet. She'd spoken about her biracial background, the fact that her ancestors were slaves. She'd spoken extensively about her charity work as well. So we had a really quite graphic picture of the type of woman she was, a feminist, somebody who believed in speaking out about her mixed race background. And I think that all of this actually was positive, in my opinion, because it gave the media a platform on which they could base their stories.
So before Meghan joined the royal family, she was an actress. She obviously had her role in Suits. And so she was really part of that kind of TV, film industry party scene, a bit of a Hollywood girl. You know, she was born and brought up in LA. So she loved party dressing. She loved that relaxed LA look as well. So it's kind of as far from royal style as you can get, really. Lots of short skirts, lots of sparkly little dresses, but also lots of kind of leggings and ripped jeans and laid back style. So It was very different from the classic princess look that you'd recognise, but she was also really stylish in her own way.
This is a woman who is well used to the red carpet, but again, months before that wedding, that will really put London on the map, won't it? Because every photographer who's interested in covering royal stories will be there to see if she turns out in that official capacity.
Absolutely true. I mean, every royal bride brings new star quality, but Meghan brings Hollywood star quality, and I think that's going to be the difference. And as you'll have seen from the interview earlier on, she's confident, she's articulate, she's assured, and that's really going to appeal not only to journalists, but to royal fans and indeed romantics around the world.
In my personal opinion, Meghan Markle is ideally suited to be a royal for two reasons. One is, as a Hollywood actress, she would be used to red carpets, she would be used to having to dress in order to be scrutinized, she would be used to getting questions fired at her by journalists.
She's very accomplished. She's starred in Suits, which was obviously a huge TV series. And she's done other interesting things as well in the past. She studied at Northwestern University, which is very prestigious. She's obviously very bright. She interned at the US Embassy in Buenos Aires, and then she got into acting. I think she went back to LA and met a manager who had seen some of her work as a student and thought, you know, she had the potential to go far, and the rest is history.
Have you ever met Miss Lindy? She's a gal with the bright red hair. Now she stands out from all the rest. You know her anywhere. Well, she's mine. Yeah, she's mine. Well, I love that little girl with the bright red hair. Well, Miss Lindy, my Miss Lindy. Well, I love that little girl with the bright red hair. Have you ever...
Did he strike you as being a very conventional kind of Englishman or as a very different kind of Englishman?
No, he struck me as being with it at that time.
What kinds of things now made you feel that about him?
I think he was ahead of his time. I think he had lots of pep, and I think he was very much ahead of his time. I think he wanted to establish things that were a little not ready for them, really, perhaps.
Wallis and Edward first met in 1931 at a high society party at Borough Court in Melton Mowbray. Initially, Edward was still involved with other women, and Wallis was still married to Ernest Simpson at this point in time. So there was no initial romance. It wouldn't be until the start of 1934, when the two met again, that an amorous relationship started to build. I think Wallis, to some extent, found a soulmate. He was a bon vivant. He lived well, he lived fast, he enjoyed the high life. He loved new technologies, he traveled widely, he partied hard. These are things that appealed to Wallis. It was also the case that he could offer her a kind of lifestyle that she wasn't necessarily getting from her husband at the time.
So rather like Edward VIII, she was a woman ahead of her time. She could not see why or how she should remain in a marriage that was abusive.
So in that respect, he represented a kind of security as well. It was also the case that Edward had a great sense of humour. He was well known for being able to tell good jokes around the dinner table, and I think she admired that in him as well. Perhaps also there was something of a lost soul. Edward has been widely portrayed by biographers and historians as someone lacking a sense of direction, and I think to some extent she felt that she could offer him that sense of direction. When she first got involved with Edward, some saw her as essentially as a gold-digging figure, interested in tapping into Edward's wealth and power. Others saw her as just Edward's most recent craze. They didn't take her particularly seriously, but as it became clear that he was besotted with her, they saw that she she really meant a great deal to him. And in that respect, I think they were happy also for the king, that particular group of people.
I think what was terribly difficult for the British public was, of course, they knew nothing about Wallis and Edward's relationship. They just saw their beloved king, you know, with his flaxen hair going about his duties. Whereas within the establishment and within society, everybody knew about their relationship. And I think that one of the cruelest aspects of history in this respect is that everybody in the Prince of Wales and Mrs. Simpson's circle who met Mrs. Simpson really liked her and really admired her and could see what a good influence she was on the king. However, it was the unholy trinity, as I call them, of palace, parliament and church who did not want Edward on the throne, and in my opinion, Mrs. Simpson became the suitable scapegoat for that. Through that process, she developed a very strong interior life when she had to live with the knowledge that she knew who she was, her close friends knew who she was, and I've read lots of those letters, and they adored her, and the rest of the world would never know. Now that takes tremendous resilience, inner resource and strength. And Edward never found that strength, that inner strength, so he was constantly relying on her to bolster him up, to make him feel better, to be his mother figure, his lover, his wife, his best friend. I mean, the demands on her emotionally were enormous. So within their society circle, there was a sense of acceptance that this was the woman that the Prince of Wales had chosen, and they could see a beneficial influence. The public were kept out of the picture. They knew nothing because there was a press moratorium, press blackout on it, and there was this absolute rage and sense of revolt in the palace and partly in Parliament and certainly within the church.
After the abdication, Edward left Britain for Europe. He travelled to Austria. He had to wait 6 months to be reunited with Wallis, and that was because Wallis's divorce had to be finalised.
When Edward and Wallis were finally reunited at the Chateau Condé in France, it's really very moving. I mean, he just rushed up the steps to be with her, and they were so tender at that stage because it really was them against the world.
The British press go wild. They've followed this story. They've waited for this moment of reunion, and there are front page photographs and headlines celebrating the fact that these two lovers are back together again.
Greatest headlines of the century. Dateline, London, December 11th, 1936. In a moment, the story.
We were introduced actually by a mutual friend. It was through her, and then we met once and then twice back to back, 2 dates in London last July.
Yes.
Beginning of July.
Harry saw Meghan's photograph on Violet von Westenholt's Instagram account because Violet does PR for Ralph Lauren, and Meghan was in this country, in England, doing some PR for Suits, and she was wearing Ralph Lauren. He saw the photograph and thought, wow, she's hot. And Violet said, well, you know, would you like to meet her? She's over here.
So they met through a mutual friend who
set them up really on a blind date, and they had their first date at Soho House in London in 2016. And then, of course, you know, with Meghan living and working at the time in Toronto in Canada, where she was filming Suits, and Harry being based in London, they realised they would have to really go out their way to make time for each other very quickly. So within a few weeks of that first date, they were on holiday together in Botswana.
They were camping under the stars. I don't think it's camping in a way that you and I know it. It's probably a bit more luxurious than that.
Prince Harry had dated a string, really, of beautiful English socialites. They tended to be blonde and willowy, very great backgrounds, you know, wealthy families, went to the right schools. However, what Meghan brought to the equation was a lot of humanitarian work that Harry's ex-girlfriends just couldn't even touch with a 10-foot pole. Meghan had actually worked for the UN. She'd gone on missions and trips to support women and children in the developing world. Meghan had been a global humanitarian long before she met Prince Harry. And I think as Harry was very close to stepping into his full role as a member of the royal family, the possibility of meeting someone who was equally passionate and engaged about changing the world and helping other people was extremely attractive to Harry. I think if you watch the engagement interview that Harry and Meghan did on BBC, and they talk about their first meeting and how they instantly connected, it's apparent that, yes, there was a mutual attraction, but it went far beyond the physical. Meghan and Harry were attracted to what each other believed in and what each other wanted to do in the world. Meghan and Harry had very much a whirlwind romance. When you are a royal trying to date someone who's a Hollywood actress, which is not unprecedented, but it is unusual, it's very important to stay under the radar. One of the big dangers of this relationship is that there would be a host of publicity, a host of press, and then the two would break up. And then both of them are plagued and haunted by the rest of their lives by questions about this relationship, which was never meant to be. So for celebrities, it's very important before they go public to make sure that it's really serious and it's gonna last, because otherwise it's just embarrassing and it's just bad publicity for everyone. In the case of Harry and Meghan, I think they knew very early on that this was potentially going to be a lifelong romance. But they were very cautious, and they tried to keep their relationship under the radar as they got to know each other to make sure before they went public. Harry made several surreptitious visits to Meghan's condo in Toronto. He would come and go, and really nobody figured out who he was. And Meghan was being, you know, secretly brought over here, stayed with him in Kensington Palace, and again, none were the wiser. Meghan and Harry kept most of their early courting days behind closed doors. You know, they say that, you know, she was cooking him a roast chicken when he proposed. They were used to spending a lot of evenings at home, having home-cooked meals, because they frankly couldn't go out to restaurants. But I think the intimacy of their early days, when they were really forced to spend most of their time alone together at home, contributed to their close connection and bond.
We had to sort of reverse the whole process, and cozy nights in front of the television, cooking dinner with you know, just the two of us by ourselves in our little cottage, rather than going out for dinner and being seen in public. So we reversed the whole process, which is it's provided different opportunities, and it's made us a hell of a lot closer in a shorter space of time.
That's true.
That's, you know, without question. So, you know, if anybody else at home is listening, then maybe, you know, slow down on the dates and maybe spend more time at home. But no, it's for us, it's an opportunity to really get to know each other without other people, you know, looking or trying to take photos on their phones and all that kind of stuff. You know, with that comes with the job, comes with the role. But
well,
where possible,
yeah. And we were able to really get to know each other that way. But also then to go and have friends over for dinner, or to go to his family for tea, or any of those sort of things. And even, you know, just to take the time to be able to go on long country walks and just talk.
We've been all over the place.
Have you met the Queen?
I have, yes.
A couple of times.
Yeah,
What was that
a
like?
couple of times. It's incredible. I think, you know, to be able to meet her through his lens, not just with his honor and respect for her as the monarch, but the love that he has for her as his grandmother. All of those layers have been so important for me, so that when I met her, I had such a deep understanding And of course, incredible respect for being able to have that time with her. And we've had a really, she's an incredible woman.
And the corgis took to you straight away.
That's true.
For the last 33 years being barked at. This one walks in absolutely nothing.
Just laying on my feet during tea. It was very sweet.
And it's just like, oh.
Windsor was, I mean, an incredible scene the day of the royal wedding. Everyone was excited. The crowds were enormous. As you came up that very famous park, it was mobbed. I mean, both sides of where their carriage was going to go was thousands and thousands of people stood back to back, ready to cheer them on. The applause, the cheers as they drove through Windsor were deafening. There was a tremendous amount of love and support for Meghan and Harry on their special day. As is custom, the Queen's wedding gift to Meghan and Harry were titles. She gave them the titles of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex.
I think everybody was stunned when Meghan got out of the Queen's Phantom Rolls Royce. I mean, she was in this virginal white dress with a beautiful train, and on the train were embroidered the emblems of the Commonwealth, because that's where going to be her area of work. And she had, obviously her borrowed thing was the tiara, which was beautiful, beautiful bandeau tiara from the Queen's collection.
There were no mixed feelings about her Stella McCartney party dress that she put on after the wedding. That was universally said to be a winner. And many people, including myself, actually preferred that dress. It was just a knockout. And there's some very famous video footage of Meghan and Harry exiting, and they look like they are literally in a James Bond movie. Harry looks so dapper. They are the most glamorous, gorgeous, sexy, beautiful couple in that moment.
When it became clear that Edward was thinking about abdicating the throne in order to marry Wallis Simpson, there was an enormously mixed reaction. You could essentially summarise it like this. The middle classes were horrified and disgusted because they saw the king having this relationship with a married woman, indeed a divorced woman, something that was completely unacceptable. The working classes didn't think anything of this. They thought it was absolutely fair enough, that they loved the king, they wanted him to be happy, and they were very, very keen that he remain on the throne. So it really split the country down the middle, and of course the upper classes were faced with this completely different idea, whereby they didn't condemn him from a moral perspective, they condemned him more from a perspective of being selfish enough to having put the country in this constitutional crisis.
Brings him strong support from those who look up to him. There are differences of opinion, too. Here are some of the views expressed.
My opinion of the king, he should marry who he loves. He's been a good chap for the working class. That's my opinion of him.
Quite apart from the fact that she isn't of noble blood, Mrs. Simpson has twice been in the divorce courts. To my mind, that completely rules her out as Queen of England.
The nation is behind him, and we must not lose him.
I am a housewife. Personally, I think he is a sign of modern democratic times. I do not think that the church should interfere in matters of state.
I am a chauffeur by profession. After all, the king is a man like myself, but he should not allow his private life to interfere with his public life.
In my opinion, the king's marriage should be a private act and considered as such. In this case, we should be able to avoid a constitutional matter. But I ask myself why the Baldwin government has forced an issue which cannot possibly be decided until next April. In my opinion, it is a possible explanation that they are concerned with the growing popularity of the king.
King Edward VIII, center of the greatest storm in Britain since the World War. Opposed to the popular ruler's desire to marry Mrs. Wallis Simpson, strides Premier Stanley Baldwin, spokesman of the old school, bulwark of conventional England. No marriage to Mrs. Simpson, Stanley Baldwin says, speaking for the British government. Here he is in typical action.
Government is a great idea.
Today in Britain's new crisis, the Premier proves that he has lost no force. Mrs. Simpson replies with a formal offer to give up the king, withdraw from the tempest which sweeps the empire, leave Edward safe upon his throne.
I think that Edward VIII's abdication speech will go down in history as one of the most iconic and moving speeches ever made.
And has ceased to reign over Great Britain and the British Empire. He announced his decision to abdicate in a farewell broadcast heard by 150 million people around the world. The radio message put an end to the crisis in England that began when the king announced his marriage to an American divorcee, Mrs. Wallis Simpson. Parliament passed a special bill legalizing the abdication.
This is Windsor Castle, His Royal Highness Prince Edward. But at long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything. But until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
One of the most difficult things for Edward and Wallis is that he had abdicated, but he couldn't go straight to Wallis's arms. Because she was in the process of waiting for her decree absolute to come through from her divorce from Ernest Simpson, there was a period of separation when they couldn't be together. And Wallis was in France, and Edward went to stay in a Schloss in Austria. It's kind of unfathomable now to think about it, but when he left England on this, this naval destroyer from Portsmouth, he hadn't really factored where he was going to go or how his life was going to be without the panoply of a royal staff and his entourage. So it's a kind of haunting image of him on the naval destroyer with his dog Slipper, very much alone, and he couldn't be united with the one woman who gave him comfort and succour. So during this time, he was in Austria and Wallis was in France. And this is the period when the letters between them are the most heartbreaking and revelatory, really. Wallis has had to accept that the abdication has happened and everything that means for her, and Edward is trying to reassure her that all will be well.
Well, after the abdication, Wallis Simpson was regarded as somebody who was dangerous. She was regarded as the woman who had destroyed the king, the woman who had brought down Edward VIII, and she was seen as somebody who was not worth bothering with. And Edward was a much more dangerous figure in terms of his politics, in terms of his associations, but she was damned by association. She was somebody who was never received again socially in Britain. She was somebody who, in America, the country of her birth, was essentially regarded as like somebody out of a freak show. And she knew all this. I mean, she was an intelligent woman. She was somebody who understood what the lines of fashion were, what the lines of society were, and that she was being regarded in this incredibly negative way. And I think she resented it on a personal level, but she never made any reference to any of this stuff. She just smiled and dressed fantastically and soaked up the slings and arrows of abuse that were directed towards her.
The greatest myth about Wallis Simpson is that it's been convenient for history to paint her as the wicked witch in this and the woman that pushed for abdication. That is the biggest lie. There is absolute concrete evidence from her friends, from her letters, from her own memoir, that she absolutely did not want the king to abdicate, that she begged him not to abdicate, that she was desperate to, as she said, slip away and fold my tent. And when she tried to escape him prior to the abdication and say, look, you know, please don't do this, I shall watch you from afar, you can be an effective king. Essentially, he said, wherever you go in the world, I shall follow you. And just prior to the abdication, one of his courtiers said he was exalté to the point of madness, and at this point was sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. And he literally emotionally blackmailed Wallis and said, if you leave me, I shall kill myself. And there was a really real possibility of that. He was so unhinged at this stage. And she just couldn't risk that. So she could not escape. But for anyone to say that Wallis Simpson wanted to be queen, that she wanted Edward to abdicate, is an utter falsehood.
I think there is now an allegation of racism hanging over a member or members of the royal family. We don't know who, as we said earlier, not the Queen, not the Duke of Edinburgh, but beyond that, we don't know who. Harry and Meghan wouldn't say. And nor do we know the context in which this remark was made. But we do know, from what we've heard, that both Harry, when he heard it, and Meghan, when it was passed on, took offence to it, and therefore that is an issue for them. And also, I think there's slightly wider questions for us as society. Harry said that he left in part because of racism in the UK. What does that mean for us? Do we need to look at ourselves a bit more? Look at the barrister that was in Rebecca Barry's report just now, who said Meghan was describing my life in the UK, and I think that is very important that we sit down to address that. And I think then on the general point for Buckingham Palace, why is it that, you know, Meghan was unable to sort of fit in? Why couldn't she get the help she needed when she desperately needed it? Although I should also point out, last week, as we discussed on this programme, there was that bullying complaint revealed against Meghan that the Human Resources Department had to look into as well. So there's a lot there.
Sir, have you spoken to your brother since the interview?
No, I haven't spoken to him yet, but I will do.
And can you just let me know, is the royal family a racist family, sir?
No, we're very much not a racist family.
It's great to hear people's stories, but as a journalist, your immediate thoughts are the truth. What is the truth? What are the facts of a scenario? And you have to investigate those, and I don't think Oprah did that enough.
The royal family's been through worse than this, but the monarchy will survive it because they're pretty indissoluble. They have their own rules, their own practices, their own club. You do not break into it. You don't change their rules. If you do, it's going to end in a mess, and it's ended in a mess, I'm afraid. I don't think any of the particular things she says, which I just don't know about, I don't think they're true. I don't think the family's racist. All the things she said we saw in the papers at the time. That is the price of celebrity. The one rule the royal family's always stuck to is don't complain, stick it out. And for better or for worse, and it's clearly for worse, and I feel sorry for them, they just couldn't handle it. But it was very difficult what they were trying to handle. They were trying to change the royal family. It doesn't happen.
Simon's absolutely right. I mean, this is a rock solid institution that very few new incomers have changed and can change. But she wasn't to know that because Harry didn't help her to know that. Harry wanted to change it. Harry wanted it to be different. Harry wanted it to be another thing.
Of course, that sense of responsibility was essentially from day one, or maybe a couple of months in when I suddenly realized, actually, this is, you know, I know that I'm in love with this girl and I hope that she's in love with me, but we still had to sit down on the sofa and I still had to have some pretty, frank conversations with her to say, look, what you're letting yourself in for is, it's a big deal. And it's, it's not easy for anybody. But I know that, at the end of the day, she chooses me and I choose her. And therefore, whatever we have to tackle together or individually will always be us together as a team. So I think she's capable
so
of...
nicely said, isn't it?
I don't know, but she's capable of anything. And together, as I said, there's a hell of a lot of stuff and work that needs doing. At the moment, for us, it's going to be making sure that our relationship is always put first. But no, look, both of us have passions for wanting to make change for good, and with lots of young people running around the Commonwealth, that's where we're going to spend most of our time, hopefully.
And it was really one of the first things we connected on. It was one of the first things we started talking about when we met, was just the different things that we wanted to do in the world and how passionate we were about seeing change. I think that was, that's what got date 2 in the books, probably.
Plenty to talk about.
There is this general perception that the British don't show racism overtly. It's kind of like... So, but then they're not saying it, but they're implying it. It's implied racism, and it's just unfathomable.
It isn't shocking to hear. To me, it sounds disappointing, upsetting, tearful, even when I watched it, because sadly, what people don't seem to understand is that racism exists all around us all the time. And so what Meghan and Harry spoke about was something that I, and no doubt a number of the 3.2% of our society who represent themselves as being black, suffer all the time.
Whilst I'm not up on protocol, royal protocol, what I will say is that, of course, they had to do something. For me, a statement is not action, and for me, and I'm sure for millions of others, we would like to see some sort of action. With the same vim that you entered into when it has been supported in the press, stories and also, I think also omission of information is just as damaging particularly to a person of colour. So I think for me, and little old me from Birmingham, I'd prefer to see action. A statement's really nice, but anyone can write something down on a piece of paper. What does that actually mean?
Well, you put it that way. I don't see it. The royal family is not a democratic institution. It was an invention in the 1960s of the royal family of the monarchy of Britain to go a different route from all the other monarchies in Europe. There's no need for a royal family. They are not necessary. They were made into celebrities. They've paid a terrible price for it, these children. They really have. I mean, goodness knows. But she bought into that. She just did. It's no good pretending it's not in some sense her doing. She bought into it. She clearly thought she could, in some sense, I don't say she wanted to capitalize on it, she wanted to change it. And she hasn't changed it. She's found it very difficult. Nobody emerges from it with much credit. You're quite right. But I'm very reluctant to say it's all one side's fault.
The fact that Americans have a fairy tale about the royal family, and this fantasy has been shattered. And particularly the statement about Archie and the color of his skin. And for America now, this is really, really not on.
To think that this is the royal family that I personally love and adore, this is the way that they behave behind closed doors.
You can argue why they're treated like that. Is it because she's a divorcee American, or is it the fact that she is a woman of colour, black woman, biracial, however you want to look at it? That's the question.
In an institution that is not that far removed from slavery and colonialism, it's not a shock here, there, anywhere that, like, I have friends who date folks of color whose families ask if that's the first question is like, is the person going to come, is your child going to come out dark?
This program has gone out in the United States. So the United States has an image of this country, and that image has been altered. So that has to be addressed. And the fact that allegations of racism, and particularly the fairly shocking revelation that made about baby Archie's skin color, that's quite a shocking thing. And it can't actually sort of be brushed aside as a kind of a joke. It actually reflects on the country. If we want to think about the nation as a brand, and people do, unfortunately, this brand has been tarnished.
I mean, I think her legacy is a woman who was misunderstood, mistreated by the establishment, and has never really been recognised for the woman she was. And until recently, I don't think her qualities have been fully celebrated. But let's face it, her legacy is a woman who changed the course of history.
Of course, it's disheartening. You know, it's a shame that is the climate in this world, to focus that much on that, or that would be discriminatory in that sense. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, I'm really just proud of who I am and where I come from, and we have never put any focus on that. We've just focused on who we are as a couple. And so when you take all those extra layers away and all of that noise, I think it makes it really easy to just enjoy being together and tune all the rest of that out.